Yes, Russia was defeated. What happened? And that's what prompted modernization of Russia. Economically backward Russia, slowly but surely started to reform herself. Okay, since many of us here studied history, so could you update us about what happened? What was the cause of the Crimean War? Okay, can you give us an idea?
Okay, so the Russians had allied themselves with the Bulgarians and the Romanians. There were several wars. They managed to get across the Danube. They destroyed several Turkish armies that were in the way. They were on the very edge of getting into Constantinople. This, both the British and the French thought was a threat to themselves. They did not want to see the Ottomans collapse, because into that they felt that the Russians would take over that entire area, which threatened their economic interests.
Exactly right.
So then they allied themselves with the Ottomans, who really did nothing in the war. The British blockaded St. Petersburg and the Baltic, and in the southern part of the war, they came in, and the French and the British landed troops in Sebastopol, and there was a long siege of the city. The Charge of the Light Brigade, the famous poem, is part of that. The Russians resisted, but they were eventually simply overwhelmed by the superior technology of the British, especially the British cannons, the fleet. And they had to surrender, and then they had to, all of their victories with the Bulgarians, etc., they had to give back all of that territory.
Thank you very much. A very good introduction for us. I appreciate it. Very kind of succinct and precise introduction. But look what happened. Progressive Britain, that was #1 industrial power, which declared ideas of liberty and freedom, sided with one of the most backward politically oppressive empire, Ottoman Empire, against equally oppressive Russian Empire that wanted to help Orthodox countries here to liberate them from Turkish domination. Okay. Russia wanted to extend her influence, so Britain economically felt threatened. France and Britain didn't want Russia to extend, to exercise her control over Constantinople, because they knew that Russia, as backward as she was, but she was able to defeat the Ottoman Empire. But what precise economic cause here? So I'm just, again, so 99% of what you said, we have to accept. It's absolutely gorgeous. But one kind of, to top up your response, Britain was afraid that Russia would be delivering grain supplies, okay? Because Russia wanted to use the Black Sea. Since at that time Russia started to switch, she almost switched already from furs and pelts. There was nothing inside there, just a little bit left. Alaska was almost gone, depleted, okay? Resources, sea water. So the major staple export of Russia was grain. They decided to gamble on grain. And Britain didn't want this grain to be delivered to the British markets. Why? Because they already adopted, pressured by free traders like Richard Cobden, a British liberty thinker, who didn't want British farmers to have monopoly on grain prices, because the people of Britain suffered. The prices for bread were high. Farmers, British farmers benefited, but regular people were losing, merchants were losing. So part of the parliament eventually destroyed this monopoly of the British farmers, opened Britain to the sale of German, Prussian grain and Russian grain. Okay. And Prussian and Russian grain started to come to British markets, which made people of Britain happy because prices for food went down, but farmers weren't happy. Okay. And Britain was afraid that soon Russia would be overwhelming, Russian overwhelming presence. They didn't want Russia to control this Mediterranean basin through Constantinople. So they decided to use this Ottoman Empire to play it against Russia, and eventually decided to be involved in the war to shut down Russia. They didn't want Russia to go to Europe, basically. But that was the original goal of Peter the Great, to open the window into Europe. But Britain didn't want it, and France didn't want it. They felt threatened. Britain started to play a long game. They were afraid that Russia, who made advances in Central Asia, okay, she, remember, eventually took over Central Asia. But in early 1850s, Russians already were coming there. And Britain was afraid that soon Russians might come to Afghanistan. So they decided to shut down this extension. By the way, see, I like kind of to put things in a historical perspective. That was the chief reason why Great Britain, progressive powers, supported the American South in the Civil War, because they were afraid of the industrial power of the North. They wanted to shut down, to suffocate North, because they viewed North, industrial North, as a competitor. And they were interested in keeping U.S. in a backward stage. It's colonial plantation economy, divided country. See, that's the irony of the situation. That's how history plays, you see. Anyway, going back to Russia.
Just one thing to add. In 1848, the Russian Tsar sent in troops to help the Austro-Hungarians suppress the revolution in Hungary. And Austria remained neutral, even though the Tsar expected the Austrians to support him in the Holy Alliance of Emperors. And that caused a great deal of friction between the two countries.
Yeah, you just added a few subtleties. At first, Russia hoped that Austria-Hungary, as a gratitude, would help. But she stayed neutral because she didn't want to antagonize Britain and France, and that's what contributed to the defeat of Russia. So Russia turned out to be alone facing these advanced countries of Europe. So, but the point we tried to make, how this defeat and what contributed to defeat, which you explained to us already well. Okay, it's a technological superiority of France and England over Russia. Russians were armed with muskets. British and French troops were armed with guns that used cartridges. Okay, cannons also. So although it was limited, still the British and the French had better medical service, because a lot of Russians died from simple wounds, because Russian medical service did not exist at that time. Russians were starving because Russia had no railroads. They couldn't receive supplies, okay, even when they were available. Okay, and numerically, Russians lost more troops, twice as much as Britain and France. It was a huge sacrifice, and eventually Russia had to sign a humiliating peace treaty, which shut down Black Sea ports for Russian vessels. Okay, it was a huge defeat, and as you said, Russians had to give up on Balkan countries, Orthodox countries. Okay. But conveniently, see, all things kind of came together. Russia was defeated during Crimean War. At the same time, Nicholas I dies right in the middle of these events, which were described, 1855. And the new Tsar comes, who was a liberal Tsar. So present-day Russian nationalists hate him. They think him, if you talk with some drunk Russian who is interested a little bit in history, he will tell you that Alexander II, it's a Western, rotten, Jewish Masonic agent who screwed up Russia because he imposed on Holy Mother Russia Western reforms. That's kind of redneck view of Alexander II. This is kind of mythology, present-day mythology. But anyway, indeed, he was a liberal Tsar who received a liberal education, by the way. So he decided to reform Russia according to Western standards. Because, like the Japanese emperor, he believed that if Russia didn't do it, she would be defeated. So it's understandable what he tried to do. The treaty was signed, see, well, that's what Russia lost. See, I forgot to tell you that, and you forgot to tell us. It's just nothing, you know. The trigger, a spark that triggered the whole conflict. We talked about real reasons for the conflict. But what triggered this war was that Russia claimed that she needed to protect Christians in Jerusalem. Okay, because Jerusalem, holy city for three religions, and Russia said she would be protecting Orthodox Christians there and all Christians there. And Ottoman Empire didn't want it, and France interfered and said, oh, Russia doesn't need to be there because there are other Christian powers. And that's how the superficial conflict. Behind this, of course, there was what we just described. So you might even skip this last bullet point. It's just for your information. There's always something that triggers the conflict. Like the First World War was triggered by an assassination. But we will be talking about this later.
Well, actually, there were no warships left in the Black Sea because the Russians destroyed the Turkish fleet. That was.
And another thing, what I did mention, is that Constantinople was not accessible to Russia. So Russia wanted to control this port. So she wasn't able to control this port. And this is very important. So with this slide, I would like you to write as much as possible what you can see here, because my attempt to explain to you what triggered modernization of Russia in the middle of the 19th century. See, first humiliating defeat, and a Russian educated segment and Russian aristocrats started to ask questions themselves. Who was responsible? How did it happen? And even die-hard landlords who owned peasants, they couldn't avoid answering the question that the problem was Russia, economic underdevelopment, if you're putting it politely, or backwardness, if you put it in the plain language. No railroad, only one railroad was in Russia, by the way, I didn't tell it, between St. Petersburg and Moscow, that's it. Before the Crimean. No telegraph. Again, another example I told you, muskets against rifles. But behind these technological underdevelopment was the bigger problem. Served delayed Russian development. And that's how some, let's call them quote-unquote progressive bureaucrats in the Russian government and the court started talking about abolition of serfdom. We need to abolish it somehow. We don't know how, but we need it. So people who belong to the class, who were to protect the class of landlords, started talking about curtailing their own interests because they knew that they had to somehow change themselves. Okay? It was a dilemma because they didn't want to lose this lucrative, profitable source of revenues because the Tsar served nobility, that was the class of people. At the same time, they knew that they had to develop factories. How can you develop factories without free labor? Yes, Peter the Great tried to do it, but how did he try to do it? He sent the serfs there. Serfs. State serfs were ascribed to particular plants, and they were wrecking equipment. They were not interested in doing these jobs. So there was no incentive. So you have to create some kind of incentives because
So
it was obvious.
So, how did this? What did this do to the Romanovs' legitimacy? What's the dynamic there?
Well, it undermined some legitimacy because Alexander II wanted to change himself and people whom he protected. Okay, so it did in the eyes of aristocrats, it did undermine his legitimacy. Those who resisted this change. Okay. At the same time, people eventually, some people came to hate him because they came to view Alexander II. We will be talking about his reforms right now. That he wasn't consistent in abolishing serfdom, okay? And they were right as well. So Alexander II was called by those people who sympathized with him a Tsar liberator, and formally, yes, he came into history as the liberator of the peasants. Enlightened politician, European experience, he traveled widely in Europe, all the Russian provinces, so he had the chance to compare and contrast. He was not, of course, a radical. At the same time, he was not a reactionary like his father. But his project was what? To somehow westernize Russia. Of course, he didn't want constitutional monarchy. He didn't want to limit his power, but at least he wanted to develop a Russian economy somehow. And in order to do it, you needed to create incentives. So let's see what he did. Okay, so that's another important slide. Okay, I was working on this yesterday, this morning, because the last version I used last year or year before when I taught this class didn't have this full information. So right now I packed it with as much information as possible, and to show you how peasants were liberated. So formally on March 1861, the Tsar printed a manifesto that was spread all over Russia, placed in all major towns, villages, read to peasants, who many of whom didn't know how to read, that Russia gave them freedom. So they didn't belong anymore to the landlords. Okay. And 5 years later, 1866, the state peasants, remember, 40% of serfs were state peasants who belonged to the crown, were read the same decree that they didn't belong to the emperor. Okay. So it's 85% of the population. It's a lot. But look how they were liberated. Okay. Russian peasants were liberated with land. So before 1861, they worked on their plots, which each year were redistributed by a commune called MIR, M-I-R. So they didn't hold this land as a private property. Okay. The land belonged to a landlord. Now, those part of the landlord domain, or those part worked by state peasants that didn't belong to imperial power, was given them not as a private property, but the land worked by peasants was given to communes. So the land collectively belonged to peasant communes, and now it was up to communes to redistribute the land each year. Okay. And a landlord or state didn't have anything to say in this. Okay. Before, it was either emperor or landlord who could interfere. So right now, the land was given to peasants, not as a private property, I want to repeat, but as a property of communes. Okay. So now, not a landlord became responsible to pay revenues, to collect revenues, but it was a peasant commune. Okay. But at the same time, look, formally, landlords lost half of their land, because an average land estate, just visual, average land estate was divided sometimes in half, sometimes 1/3 landlord, peasant holdings. Okay. So peasant holdings had a bunch of streets, worked by peasants. Okay. The whole thing belonged to a landlord, okay? But this was separated for peasants. They who were holding these strips of land were redistributed by a commune each year. But the landlord could diminish this land, could increase it. But at the same time, another half of the field belonged to a landlord. And the peasants were obligated to work half of the week, just on average, on landlord's field, the rest of the stuff to work on their strips. So now this part became the property of a commune. Okay.
So, like, did it change like the everyday lives of like people who used to be serfs, or was it just like a change on paper, or did it like actually make like a difference in their day to day like?
Yes and no. That's a peculiarity of the situation. Okay. Because legally they became free citizens. Okay, free citizens, which was good. They could travel to a neighboring town to sell things. Before they couldn't move out without written permission. As any slave in any country had to have a written permission of a master. Now they didn't need to take permission. They could go to a town to sell, to buy things. They could buy, if they had money, little. A few of them had money actually. But some enterprising shrewd peasants were able to use the noodles somehow, but not many, because they were still restrained by a commune. They could operate outside of commune. But the problem was that they had to pay back money lost by landlords to the government that paid on their behalf. So government paid to the landlords for this part. So let's say there were, 50,000 landlords in Russia, maybe more, I don't remember the exact number. I gave you once the number, like 50 or 60,000 landlords. And since they lost half of this land, government paid to landlords. But the burden of paying back to the government was imposed on peasants. It's like mortgage. If imagine you buy a house and it's 49-year mortgage, okay, that's what happened with peasants. And interest was 5.6%. That's it. Okay, that's what I was working this morning trying to find as much information as possible to explain it to you. And I stated, so peasants, and that is why I appreciate your questions. So you asked me questions, so one more time. Did they actually become free? And I'm answering yes and no. Legally they became free, but at the same time, they couldn't leave this house because they had a 49-year mortgage. And a person couldn't move out of his or her peasant commune because a commune wouldn't allow you to move out. Because you have this obligation to pay back to the government. Unless somebody steps in and buy your share, paying your share, okay, to the commune, which would be delivered by the commune to the government. See, but very few people like this existed. Very few, because normally an average peasant family started living this in a peculiar status, free and unfree at the same time. And it was called temporary responsibility status. So they were temporarily responsible to pay to the government for 49 years, and before paying back to the government, they couldn't leave. Okay. And finally, it was as late as 1907. 1907. That's when the government finally canceled this mortgage for entire Russian and some Ukrainian peasantry. Okay, see, that's what eventually produced so much discontent, because they had to pay and pay and pay and pay. And since people were poor and the small strips couldn't generate enough grain to be so market grain, okay, the present communes, it was subsistence agriculture, so it was hard for them to pay back. Well, it's a lifetime bondage. Okay.
Question. Since there were no schools in these villages, who was keeping all the records?
By the way, one of the first reforms of Alexander II was establishing schools in the villages, okay, parochial schools. So local churches were assigned to, give an assignment literally by the government to organize schools. And each peasant commune had to hire scribes who kept the records, okay? So for the first time they had exact records who owed what, because it was very important for the government. Yeah, each peasant commune was responsible for doing these payments. By the way, jumping ahead, I want to inform you that that explains why Stalin on the communes was so much successful establishing collective farms in the Russian countryside, because he literally brought back this tradition of peasant communes and put Russian and Ukrainian peasants in bondage again, reinvoking the same system in the new guise, of course, under the pretext of communism. Okay, I would like to add a few things about borderlands. So we just talked about what? Russia proper and the northern part of what today we call Ukraine. Okay. But what about the rest of the areas of the empire? First, in Siberia, there was no serfdom. No serfdom, because Kazakhs moved to the Far East, free homesteads, like American Western. The rest of Siberia, indigenous nations, tribute and first delivery, okay, this Mongol way of exploiting people, okay? So no serfdom. Baltic states were liberated as early as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, 1816, 1817. But look what happened in Baltic states, because the dominant group was Baltic Germans. They were aristocrats, and local indigenous people were oppressed. They were peasant serfs. So it was a very, very explosive situation in Baltic countries, because see, in Russia it was like a class hatred sometimes on the aristocrats, peasants who belong to the same formal and linguistic group. But here in Baltic countries, German-speaking people exploited people who spoke different language. So the Tsar liberated them, gave them total freedom of movement. They didn't owe anything. But at the same time, they were not given land. So German-speaking aristocrats maintained all their estates, but peasants, local indigenous peasants in Baltic countries became free. So what happened then? They became what? How do we call these people? Many of them tenant farmers. Tenant farmers. So they were hired by German-speaking aristocrats to work on the land. They were paid in cash. Okay, but formerly they were free. They could go anywhere. They could go abroad. Okay, it was good. So Russian peasants couldn't do it. Finland, I forgot to tell you. Finland never had serfdom at all. Okay, when she was incorporated into the Russian Empire, when 1807, I will tell you even more. In 1858, before Tsar started to do his reforms and before issuing the decree about liberation of peasants in Russia proper, he goes to Finland and delivers a speech in the Finnish parliament, saying, where he says that Finnish language should be the state language of Finland, where he confirmed the rights of Finnish people to have elections. It's amazing. He even supported so-called Finnomania. It's desire movement among Finnish intelligentsia, intellectuals, to defend interests of Finnish people against Sweden. It was a geopolitical game the Russian Tsar played in order to protect his empire against Sweden. He didn't want Finland to side with Sweden, and he accomplished his goal. So Finnish people very much supported Alexander II, treated him as a not as a liberator, as a kind of supporter of their own nationhood. So Alexander II, ironically, became an engine behind the growth of Finnish nationalism. So Finnish nationalism was growing in the second half of 19th century, supported by Alexander II. Okay. In fact, if you go to Helsinki, right now you will see a big monument on a central plaza, monument to Alexander II. Okay, because for them, he was a big guy who contributed to the nation, to the growth of Finnish nationhood. Okay. Another interesting example, in 1864, in Poland, remember, Polish people kept revolting against the Russian Tsar, wanted to have autonomy, something like what Finnish people had. But their final goal was to get independence, because Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been an independent nation. And the Tsars realized this, and that is why they were not eager to give autonomy to Poland. Okay. There were constant attempts to suppress Polish language, Polish autonomy, Polish self-government. They revolted last time I mentioned. In 1830, there was a big revolt, armed revolt against the Russian Tsar. The second revolt was in 1864. Polish aristocrats, most aristocrats, who dreamed about restoring their autonomy. Remember how Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was organized? It was an aristocratic republic where aristocrats had the total power and the king never had any power. They appointed the king. So they were dreaming about getting back this power. And Polish peasants were liberated with land. Okay, with land. At a modest cost. Government actually covered 20% of what they owned to landlords. Okay. I put this question why, you probably know why. Because the Russian government, imperial government, wanted to penalize Polish aristocrats for nourishing these ideas of independence. In fact, as a result of 1864 revolt, Polish revolt against the Russian troops, many Polish aristocrats' estates were confiscated and given to peasants. So Russians distributed the land among the peasants. It's a very peculiar situation. Okay. So in Poland, we have a big class of private farmers emerging who had their own homesteads. Good thing. That is why Poland became a prosperous part of the Russian Empire. There was a free labor, free farming, because of this peculiar situation. I'm going to put you down, damn aristocrats, you know, you're my class, but you don't want to be with me. Unlike this Finnish people or Baltic Germans, so we're going to destroy you, and we're going to use peasants against you. See, that was the logic. Finally, these borderlands like Georgia, liberation for peasants came very late, because these were let's put it again politely, Oriental countries with a long tradition of serfdom. Okay. So it took time here because local lords didn't want to liberate the peasants. So that is why there were additions, amendments to decree issued by the Tsar that in these borderlands, Caucasus Mountains, in Central Asia, for instance, I forgot to mention Central Asia, similar in 1880s, serfdom was abolished. In some parts of Central Asia, serfdom was never abolished. Like there were principalities, parts of Turkestan, remember the big area conquered by the general von Kaufmann. There were a couple of principalities, Bukhara, Khiva, where serfdom survived until 1970. Okay, because that was part of the local tradition, and local khans concluded a compromise with the empire. Azerbaijan, Armenia, 1870, 1883, as late as 1883, Armenia, that's when serfdom was abolished. After liberation of peasants, again, you can put this expression in quotation marks, there was a big population explosion. Why? Why was the big population explosion? Primarily, why population explosion? Any ideas?
Probably they had like more autonomy just in their everyday lives. They could like just go, or peasants could just go have kids with whoever they wanted.
I'm sorry, say it again. I'm sorry.
Peasants or people could just go have kids with whoever they wanted to without like any oversight or anything like that. So
Yeah, let's move in this direction or maybe other things.
Improved quality of life, making it so that, having larger families was more feasible. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Plus,
good.
more
Yeah, good.
kids to work in the fields that
Say it again.
more kids to work in the fields.
Better hygiene, better health, so that the infant mortality rate went down.
It was still high, but you also have a point because, in fact, medical schools were opened in Russia and nurses were sent to the villages for the first time. Yeah, you're right. Okay, partially all these remarks you made, partially they're right. Because, in fact, what we just heard, that living standards improved. Again, they were still very low compared to living standards of Finnish people, or Polish peasants, or Western Europeans, but still they did improve living standards. Why? Because partially peasants became free. So they didn't have to work for the landlord. Even they didn't have their land as a private property, but at least they could work for themselves. Yes, they owed a lot of money, they had to pay high revenues, but they had to work for their family. And that is why they wanted to have as many kids as possible. Some of you mentioned this. They wanted, I forgot who, they wanted to have, as many kids as possible. Because if I receive this trip and I hold this, and I don't have to work for this guy, let's work hard. Maybe we're able to save something. So people tried to have economic reasons. The birth rate was huge. Okay, this partial freedom was good. It contributed to the growth of population. Okay. At the same time, government tried to squeeze Jews from the peasants. Again, the commune was the major chief object of taxation. Okay. Plus, Russian peasants were heavy drinkers, and the Russian government introduced indirect sales taxes for vodka, which was 1/3 of all revenues. It's a big deal. Okay. Another thing, remember I mentioned that the grain gradually was becoming the major product of export for Russian government, and that's how they were doing it. They were purchasing grain from peasants, from peasant communes, at low cost and exporting at the high price. Late Stalin used the same thing. Again, I cannot resist this. Stalin, when he wanted to industrialize the Soviet Union in 1920s, 1930s, he did the same thing. Before peasants were put in bondage completely, they were issued production quotas, but before collective farms were established under communism in the 1920s, government did the same thing, purchasing grain at low cost and selling grain abroad for higher price, getting hard currency. So here it had been pioneered during this time of modernization in Russia, 1860s, 1870s, and this money was used to start railroad construction, building factories. Okay, just population, I mentioned this, no need to mention it again, just numbers, how quickly number of peasant population was growing. Okay. All right. So peasants were free, not from the government, but from landlords. They legally were not dependent anymore. They could marry whomever they wanted. It was a big deal. I repeat, they could travel to a city, to a town. Of course, they were obligated to get back. They couldn't just move out. See, that is why we are saying that they were partially free. But they could visit friends. A military reform was done, which was a big deal for peasants, because before the Crimean War, it was 25 years draft. So a peasant literally had to say goodbye to his own relatives if he was recruited into the army. Now, it was universal military draft, 7 years. It's still a long time, but there was a hope to get back. Schooling, what we just mentioned, schooling was started for the first time, never existed before. So that is why by 1914, not everybody, but some peasants became educated. I repeat, some peasants became educated. Why? Because at this point, you needed to fight peasant commune to make peasant families to accept education. Why? Because they didn't want to lose workers. Some peasants believed it was a waste of time to go to school. Okay? Because tradition never existed to get education because it had not been encouraged in the first place. Okay? And now when government started to encourage local intellectuals to open schools in villages, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Or churches were encouraged to open parochial schools. Because I repeat, some peasants wanted to school their children, some of them didn't want for economic reasons. Peasant courts.
What were redemption payments? Could you,
It's just this mortgage, 49-year mortgage.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm sure it's using different word. Okay.
That's
Uh-huh.
that's what I was gonna say.
Some peasants were able to move out. Very few, I repeat, very few, who were able to purchase their freedom. They had to pay back to their communes. There was a small segment of peasants who practiced crafts, who were selling pottery, who were selling some clothing in towns. So they were able to accumulate money. And they paid money to the communes. And the communes gave them passports. So they could move out. I repeat, very few. But most peasants were still locked in communes. So that's what we need to. 90% of peasants were still locked in communes because they didn't have money to buy themselves out. (1864), yeah.
So like in this time, in this like industrialization, who was like working in like the
In factories,
if serfs were locked in, or like if peasants were locked in like their agricultural economy?
Mostly Polish people, Baltic people, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Finnish people. There was a migration of Finns to St. Petersburg, where they worked in factories. Okay. Who else? Town residents, some Russians, some and a few peasants who were able to migrate to big cities. I repeat, who were able to buy themselves out. But not many. That is why many workers, industrial workers, had foreign names. Okay, St. Petersburg, Moscow. German names, Estonian names. Still, peasants could not spread their wings. Not yet. Important reform was a local self-government. For the first time in Russian history, so-called zemstva. Zemstva, it means land rule. That's how it's translated. Literal translation. Land rule. Land rule. So local self-government. All Russia was divided into districts. It had been done before, and now each district had regions, and in each region, people were encouraged to have self-government. In each self-government, 74% were reserved for nobles. See, again, still landlords who had to be of noble origin, so they had to belong to old lineages. But at the same time, church people were allowed, merchants and small landowners, some peasants who became landowners, or merchants who became landowners. Delegates, those few peasants who were able to represent communes, they were elected by mayors. So these communes came together, elected their representatives to represent their interests in local self-government. Of course, it was no democracy where predominant power was reserved for landlords. See, it shows still where the loyalty of the empire was, because they wanted to guarantee that in local self-government, the people of their own class would be represented, okay? But landlords were 1.3% of the population. I'm talking about Russia proper. Excluding Siberia, excluding Ukraine, just Russia proper is Muscovite Russia. But at least some movement toward some representation, it was good, I guess. Judicial reform. Judicial reform was the most progressive reform because all people became equal in the eyes of the law. It was a good thing. It was a good thing. Because before, people were treated differently. Nobles, church people. Peasant courts were created, but in 1870s, peasant courts gave rise to regular courts. So in 1870s, Russia received the same court system based on the trial by jury. So it was very good. Death penalty was abolished, unusual. Russia was among a few countries in the world at that time. I repeat, it's kind of strange things because as far as I remember from what I read, in France and the United States, they had the death penalty. In fact, we have the death penalty now. But at that time, in this backward Russia, authoritarian regime, the death penalty was abolished. It was reintroduced later when Alexander II was killed. He was killed, jumping ahead here.
Was this a time that they abolished flogging? Is that related to
Flogging, yeah. Because a very important remark you just made, because flogging was a staple punishment for peasants. So now, for instance, in peasant communes, they didn't practice it. So how could they? Because it was the same commune, same rights, you know. An elder in a commune couldn't flog another peasant, so they were equal in this case. Governmental officials couldn't flog. In the army, there were some physical punishments maintained, but only after soldiers were court-martialed. Okay? There was no just arbitrary punishment from nowhere. Like before abolition of serfdom, it was a routine method of disciplining people. Physical punishment. But now, not anymore. Okay, military reform, since we mentioned military reform, universal military conscription, military district system, railroads were built. Railroad construction was built primarily for strategic purposes. Why? Because Crimean War showed how bad Russia was in terms of supplying her army. So now railroads were built from Moscow to Ukraine to Crimea. In fact, Alexander II invited foreign banks, foreign investors to bring money to build railroads. In fact, one of the reasons why Alaska was sold to the United States, because Russian Tsar Alexander II wanted to raise money to jumpstart railroad construction. Russia sold Alaska for $7.5 million. And this money never came to Russia. Tsar used it to buy locomotives in the United States, in England, and everything was delivered, and some equipment, railroad equipment. So, and everything was delivered to Russia because the Tsar was obsessed with railroad construction. And of course, the chief goal was strategic, to build the railroads, as many as possible, to connect distant parts of Russia with each other. But economically it was good, because now merchants could deliver their merchandise quicker. Okay, it's just, there's nothing here. It's about Poland. Yeah, I already mentioned this. I don't want to clog your minds with additional information. We talked about Poland and how the Russian government tried to use Polish peasants against Polish landlords. Okay. Now, let me build a bridge between what we did today and what we're going to do next time. Okay. Alexander II built a few universities, several universities, opened universities, opened medical schools, encouraged science, knowledge, book printing flourished. Okay. So, to make a long story short, a small group of intellectuals emerged in Russia. They became known as intelligentsia. You heard this expression, intelligentsia. So educated people, well-read, widely read, who either worked for the government or worked as teachers in village schools, town schools, okay, or professors at the universities. A small but influential group. Why? Because they were publishing essays, publishing magazines about how Russia should develop, and they became like masters of the minds. So they created public opinion. It's like in our days, for instance, compare the influence of intelligentsia at that time, especially in such countries like Russia, where still a huge number of people were uneducated. So the significance of this group of people was it was a very powerful group of people because they published magazines, they controlled the intellectual discourse, they controlled the debate. It's like today, for instance, we have Twitter, right? Who writes for Twitter? 0.05% of the people, mostly professors who have plenty of time on their hands, reporters, and they have all of them have their own ideological agendas, and they argue with each other. The wars, the cultural wars, right? And they influence opinions of people. Or TikTok, for instance. Some move to TikTok. So I doubt that people who work regular jobs, or sometimes 2 or 3 jobs, have time for this, right? They have no time for this. I wanted to say crap. Not everything is crap, of course. There's some 1, 2, 3 sentences that are allowed on Twitter. Sometimes they make sense, how frequently they don't make sense, or simplify things. But they influence our discourse, right? We become mad, angry. Sometimes political agenda is created out of a thin air because of Twitter. Some personalities become prominent because of Twitter. Same thing was going on here. Okay, like 90% of population were doing regular jobs, working factories, peasants working on the lands. But this group of people controlled the discourse. They came to control discourse because they control schools, universities. Or they worked as scribes, as teachers. Okay. So their position was very important, and they influenced the Russian court, the Tsar, and the people who were around him, because they created public opinion.